The moment her hand came down, the entire neighborhood froze, and I knew nothing could undo what she'd just done. An HOA board member had just slapped an 81-year-old veteran sitting in a wheelchair, then doubled down by claiming he was faking his disability. Phones were already out. Reports were already being written. And somewhere in the chaos, a line was crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. That should have ended it, but it didn't. Instead, the HOA made a decision that turned a public outrage into a legal nightmare. I didn't realize it then, but that single accusation triggered a chain of consequences that would cost them everything. And the next move they made was their worst mistake yet. By the time that slap happened, tension had already been living in this neighborhood for weeks. It just hadn't exploded yet. What most people didn't see was how tightly the HOA had been squeezing control long before that moment, or how deliberately they chose their targets. I was already on edge when I got involved, because nothing about their behavior felt accidental. I lived a few houses down from the veteran. Everyone knew him. 81 years old. Quiet. Kept his place immaculate without showing it off. He used a wheelchair most days, not because he wanted sympathy, but because it let him keep his independence. The HOA knew that too. They'd approved his accessibility ramp years earlier. That was the first thing that made what came later feel so wrong. The neighborhood itself looked calm on the surface. Manicured lawns. Identical mailboxes. Flags out front on holidays. The kind of place that advertises community standards like a selling point. But calm never lasts long when rules stop being about order and start being about power. And I didn't realize then how far the HOA was willing to go to prove they were in charge. The first sign came in the form of notices. Not loud ones. Not urgent. Just quiet pieces of paper taped to doors and slipped into mailboxes. Warnings about compliance. Reminders about approval forms. Requests to verify things that had already been approved years earlier. At the time, it seemed minor, routine even. That was the mistake. The veteran got one of those notices about his wheelchair ramp. The wording was vague. Something about updated standards and temporary accommodation. Nothing threatening yet. But I remember the look on his face when he showed it to me. Confused. Not angry. Just unsure why this was suddenly an issue again. I didn't realize what that notice really meant. A week later, another one appeared. This time with a deadline. Then a fine mentioned casually at the bottom. That was when the pattern became harder to ignore. The HOA wasn't clarifying rules. They were escalating pressure. And they were doing it quietly enough that no one felt alarmed, yet. Around the same time, the HOA board started showing up in person. Not as a group. Just one member at a time. Always during the day. Always when they thought fewer people were watching. They'd linger near the veteran's driveway. Take photos. Make notes. I could tell by the way they looked at him that this wasn't about compliance anymore. It was about authority. I remember thinking that if he just submitted another form, or if someone higher up stepped in, it would stop. That assumption didn't last long. The next notice accused him of misrepresentation. No explanation. No evidence. Just a line implying that his disability might not qualify under updated guidelines. That was the first time I felt real unease. What bothered me most wasn't the accusation itself, it was the confidence behind it. The HOA was acting like they already knew the outcome. Like they didn't need to prove anything. And the veteran, being who he was, didn't fight back right away. He believed there had been a mistake. He trusted the process. That trust gave the HOA room to move. They scheduled a compliance review without clearly stating what was being reviewed. Then they warned of penalties for non-cooperation. At the time, it still felt administrative, bureaucratic. But pressure has a way of revealing intent, and theirs was becoming harder to hide. By the morning of the incident, the atmosphere had shifted. HOA board members were present. Clipboards out. Phones ready. The veteran was already anxious, even before anyone said anything. I remember thinking this had gone too far, and that whatever happened next wouldn't stay private. What I didn't know then was that the HOA had already decided how this would end. And the enforcement notice they issued that day wasn't a warning at all. It was a trigger. The pressure didn't ease after the enforcement notice. It intensified in ways that felt calculated. almost experimental. The HOA stopped waiting for responses and started acting as if silence was consent. New notices appeared before the deadlines on the old ones expired. Each letter referenced a different rule, a different justification, as if they were searching for something that would finally break him. The veteran tried to stay calm. I could see it taking effort. He organized paperwork, gathered old approvals, made copies of everything. For a moment, it felt like preparation might be enough. That small sense of control didn't last long. The HOA rejected his submission without explanation. No reason given. No correction offered. Just a statement that compliance had not been achieved. That rejection unlocked the next step. A second fine arrived, larger than the first, with a shorter deadline. It referenced ongoing investigation. That phrase kept showing up. Vague, heavy, designed to sound official without saying anything specific. I remember thinking this was the worst it could get. I thought the escalation would peak here. It didn't. Within days, neighbors started getting involved, not to help, but to interfere. Someone complained about parking. Another reported noise that didn't exist. The HOA treated each complaint as independent, but the timing was too precise to ignore. Pressure was being applied from multiple directions now, all at once. It felt coordinated even if no one admitted it. The veteran grew more cautious. He avoided going outside unless necessary. He stopped waving to people. That withdrawal was subtle, but it mattered. It changed how the situation looked to anyone passing by. The HOA used that change against him. They documented behavioral concerns. They began framing him as uncooperative. At the time, it seemed minor. Administrative language. But I didn't realize what that framing allowed them to do next. Another inspection was scheduled. This one included language about verification. That word hit harder than the fines. Verification of what, exactly, wasn't stated. It didn't need to be. The implication was enough. The veteran asked for clarification. He got none. That uncertainty lingered like a threat. The day before the inspection, a notice appeared warning of temporary corrective action if compliance wasn't met. Temporary sounded harmless. It wasn't. It meant immediate consequences without final determination. The HOA was giving itself permission to act first and explain later. The inspection itself felt less like a process and more like a verdict in motion. HOA members arrived already confident. They took photos without asking. They spoke in absolutes. The veteran tried to explain, but explanations weren't what they came for. When it ended, they didn't say he'd passed or failed. They said a decision would be issued. That waiting period was worse than the inspection. Every day without an answer made the threat feel more real. And when the decision finally came, it didn't resolve anything. It escalated everything. The HOA declared the ramp subject to removal pending verification of eligibility. That single line changed the balance of power. It turned accommodation into suspicion. It placed the burden entirely on him. At the time, it sounded temporary. That was the illusion. The fines increased again. Appeals were ignored. Deadlines overlapped. Each attempt to comply triggered a new demand. Every mini-resolution unlocked a bigger problem. And the HOA never slowed down. They accelerated. Rumors started spreading faster now. People whispered about fraud, about exaggeration, about special treatment. The HOA never corrected those stories. They benefited from them. Doubt became a tool. And doubt isolates faster than any fine. The veteran noticed it. He mentioned feeling watched. That pressure wore him down more than the paperwork ever did. Still, he didn't lash out. He didn't raise his voice. He trusted that facts would matter eventually. That trust was being exploited. Then came the compliance hearing notice. It wasn't framed as optional. Attendance was expected. Consequences were listed but not defined. That uncertainty again. It felt like a trap, but ignoring it felt worse. He agreed to attend. I thought maybe this was where things would slow down. I thought wrong. The hearing didn't bring clarity. It brought confidence from the HOA. They deferred judgment again and authorized temporary enforcement measures. That phrase sounded procedural. In reality, it was permission. permission to confront, permission to act. The next HOA visit was different. More people, more authority, less restraint. The veteran looked overwhelmed before anyone even approached him. He asked what was happening. No clear answer was given. That moment felt unstable, like something could snap. And it did. The accusation didn't start as a shout. It started as a statement, a claim that his disability might not be legitimate. That claim shifted the entire tone. It reframed everything retroactively. The fines, the inspections, the pressure. Suddenly, the HOA wasn't enforcing rules. They were exposing alleged misconduct. The slap happened in that atmosphere. Not loud, not dramatic, just sudden. It landed with a kind of finality that changed the energy instantly. Phones came out. People froze. The HOA member didn't retreat. She escalated. Claiming he was faking his disability wasn't just cruel. It was reckless. That accusation couldn't be taken back. It couldn't be managed quietly. It transformed a neighborhood dispute into a public incident. I thought that would stop everything. I thought reason would finally intervene. It didn't. Within hours, the HOA issued another notice. This one-sided behavioral violations and interference with enforcement. It reframed the incident as resistance, as misconduct by the veteran. That decision shocked me. Instead of backing away, they doubled down. That notice spread fast. Faster than they expected. Neighbors shared it. People outside the community saw it. The narrative slipped out of the HOA's control. And still, they pushed forward. They scheduled removal proceedings. They referenced authority they didn't clearly have. They set deadlines that didn't align with any documented process. Everything felt rushed. Panicked. Or arrogant. Maybe both. I remember reading the final notice and realizing something was wrong with it. Not morally, legally. Dates didn't line up. Citations were incorrect. Claims were made that contradicted earlier statements. At the time, the HOA didn't seem to notice. Or they didn't care. That document locked them into a position they couldn't quietly undo. It committed them to an outcome they hadn't fully thought through. And it handed us something solid in the middle of all that chaos. The HOA thought they were asserting control. What they actually did was make a move they couldn't take back. And none of us realized yet just how far that mistake would travel. The shift didn't come with an apology or a pause. It came with paperwork. Thick, formal, unmistakable. The HOA thought their last notice had boxed the veteran in. What they didn't realize was that it had done the opposite. It gave us something solid to push back against, and once that happened, everything started moving faster than they could control. The first decisive move wasn't loud. It wasn't public. It was precise. The veteran authorized a formal response that challenged the HOA's authority line by line. Not emotionally. Not rhetorically. Methodically. The notice they'd issued was dissected, cross-referenced, and exposed. Timelines conflicted. Citations didn't apply. Procedures were skipped. At the time, it felt risky. Like poking something that was already angry. But doing nothing felt worse. That response triggered an immediate reaction. The HOA didn't back down. They escalated again. Another enforcement action. Another deadline. Another threat layered on top of the last. But this time, their confidence felt forced. As if they were trying to outrun something. And that's when the second move landed. Evidence surfaced. Documents the HOA hadn't expected to see again. Prior approvals. Medical verifications they claimed not to have. Records showing that the ramp had been reviewed, approved, and reaffirmed multiple times over the years. The narrative they'd built started to crack under its own weight. The accusation of faking didn't just look cruel now. It looked reckless. That should have slowed them down. It didn't. Instead, the HOA doubled down publicly. They reframed their actions as protecting community standards. They insisted the issue wasn't disability, but compliance. That argument might have worked if they hadn't already crossed the line. But they had. And now, people were paying attention. The turning point came when the incident stopped being internal. Footage surfaced. Not edited. Not dramatic. Just clear enough to show what happened. The slap. The accusation. The aftermath. Context stripped away any remaining ambiguity. This wasn't enforcement. It was abuse of power, captured in a way that couldn't be explained away. The HOA tried to regain control. Emergency meetings were called. Statements were drafted. Blame shifted internally. But none of that reached the outside world fast enough. The story had momentum now, and momentum doesn't wait for spin. The veteran's most decisive move came next. He refused a private settlement. That decision stunned everyone involved. It would have ended the fines, stopped the harassment, restored his peace. But it would have buried the truth. He chose exposure over comfort. That choice raised the stakes instantly. Formal complaints were filed. Not just about the slap, but about the pattern leading up to it. Selective enforcement. Retaliation. Procedural violations. Each claim was supported by the HOA's own documents. The same paperwork they'd used to intimidate him now worked against them. The HOA's response grew frantic. They attempted to suspend enforcement temporarily, then partially, then quietly. Each attempt contradicted the last. Their authority, once absolute, now looked unstable. Board members began distancing themselves. Attendance dropped. Confidence evaporated. Then came the legal bombshell. A higher authority intervened, triggered by the volume and clarity of the complaints. Suddenly, the HOA wasn't just dealing with a homeowner. They were answering questions they couldn't deflect. Requests for records. Explanations for discrepancies. Justifications for actions taken without due process. The fines were frozen. Not forgiven. Frozen. That distinction mattered. It signaled uncertainty. And uncertainty terrified them. I remember watching the board's posture change almost overnight. Emails softened. Deadlines vanished. Language shifted from demands to requests. The same people who had spoken in absolutes now hedged every sentence. Power was leaking out of their hands, and they could feel it. But the peak hadn't hit yet. The confrontation everyone expected didn't happen in a courtroom or a meeting room. It happened on paper. A formal finding landed that challenged the HOA's core authority in this case. It didn't resolve everything. It questioned everything. Their justification for enforcement was deemed unsupported. Their handling of the incident was flagged as improper. Their internal process was called into doubt. It wasn't a verdict. It was worse. It was an invitation for consequences. The HOA's last attempt to assert control came quickly after that. They issued one final notice. Rewritten. Narrowed. Technically cleaner. It tried to salvage enforcement without acknowledging wrongdoing. On the surface, it looked like a compromise. In reality, it was a gamble. That notice became their point of no return. It contradicted earlier claims. It implicitly admitted the ramp was valid. It undermined the accusation of fraud. And it exposed how much they were willing to rewrite their own position to avoid accountability. The veterans team caught it immediately. Everything tightened after that. Public attention intensified. Board members resigned quietly. Legal counsel changed. The HOA stopped speaking entirely. Silence replaced authority. And silence, after so much noise, spoke volumes. I didn't realize then what that final notice would set in motion. Because the moment they issued it, they lost the ability to control how this ended. They'd documented their retreat without admitting fault. They'd weakened their own enforcement history. And they'd created a record that couldn't be erased. The highest tension didn't come from shouting or confrontation. It came from waiting. Waiting to see which version of events would survive. Waiting to see who would be held responsible. Waiting to see how far the fallout would spread. The veteran stayed quiet through all of it. Steady. Not because it was over, but because he knew it wasn't. The HOA's power had collapsed inward, but the damage they'd done was already moving outward. And as the next phase began, one thing became clear. This wasn't just about what they did to him. It was about what was about to happen to them. It took weeks for the dust to settle, but when it finally did, the landscape of the neighborhood had changed in ways no one could ignore. The HOA, once untouchable, had been stripped of the authority it had wielded so confidently. Deadlines, fines, and arbitrary rules vanished, Not because someone had begged or negotiated, but because the system had been held accountable. The legal findings and documentation exposed gaps and missteps that couldn't be ignored or rewritten. For the first time, it was clear, the power they had assumed was never absolute, and their overreach came with consequences. The veteran, despite everything he endured, emerged with quiet dignity intact. His ramp remained. His access remained unquestioned. But more than that, his integrity was recognized publicly. The footage, the documentation, the careful record-keeping, all of it had cemented a narrative the HOA couldn't control. Neighbors who had watched silently now spoke up, acknowledging the injustice. What had been a private struggle had become a lesson in oversight and accountability. Some board members resigned quietly. Others shifted their focus, perhaps realizing their prior arrogance carried risk. The community itself felt the aftershock. Conversations in the cul-de-sac were no longer casual greetings. They were cautious, observant, more aware of the thin line between rules and abuse of power. The reputation of the HOA had been permanently altered. No longer could they rely on intimidation or selective enforcement. The story had made that clear. Legally, the HOA faced scrutiny and the threat of oversight. Their bylaws were reviewed, their enforcement powers questioned. Fines issued in the wake of the incident were overturned. Documents they had relied on for authority now served as evidence of procedural error. Their influence, once subtle but pervasive, was openly challenged. And yet, the veteran never gloated. He didn't need to. The results spoke for themselves, in the form of restored fairness, recognition, and respect. For the neighborhood, the ripple effects lingered. People began to question minor infractions, petty rules, and unchecked authority. Conversations that had once been superficial now included cautionary tales, shared warnings, and observations about power. The HOA's failure became a case study in what happens when authority is assumed rather than earned. That lesson wasn't lost on anyone, and the veteran's quiet perseverance became a benchmark for what standing up could look like. Even months later, the street retained traces of the chaos, some cautious glances, some whispered comments. But the tension had evolved into vigilance. People watched, yes, but they also understood accountability. The HOA had learned the hard way that control without responsibility is fleeting. What had seemed like a relentless spiral toward humiliation and fines had turned into a public reckoning, not through anger or confrontation, but through steadfast adherence to facts and process. Financially, the HOA had to reconsider its operations. Improperly issued fines and threatened liens left gaps they couldn't ignore. Members who had relied on intimidation suddenly faced tangible consequences. The documentation the veteran provided became a precedent for how future disputes would be handled, and the HOA could no longer assume their interpretation of rules would go unchallenged. Authority now required transparency, not assumption. The veteran's personal life returned to a cautious normal, but he carried with him a sense of vindication and clarity. The ordeal had proven something critical. Compliance and obedience are one thing, but fairness and integrity are the measures that endure. He had faced a system designed to intimidate, and yet, by sticking to facts, remaining calm, and documenting every step, he turned an overwhelming power imbalance into accountability. Socially, the impact resonated beyond just our block. Stories of the incident traveled through informal networks and local news. Neighbors in nearby communities began sharing their experiences, comparing HOA enforcement tactics, questioning authority, and recognizing that even well-maintained communities can harbor systemic overreach. The ripple effect of that single confrontation extended far beyond what anyone imagined at the start. By the time the veteran was able to reflect fully, the scope of the victory was clear. It wasn't about fines reversed or documents filed. It was about power recalibrated. It was about fairness restored in a place that had long mistaken compliance for control. And it was about a simple truth made obvious: authority without accountability inevitably collapses. Looking back, it's astonishing how quickly small infractions and selective enforcement escalated into near crisis. The loop of tension, pressure, and confrontation that defined those weeks could have ended differently if patience or passivity had prevailed. But the combination of evidence, Procedural diligence and resilience tipped the scale. The veteran didn't need to fight with anger. He fought with precision, with quiet determination, and with an understanding that systems, no matter how entrenched, can be challenged successfully. The HOA may have survived as an organization, but its perceived authority was permanently altered. Community members learned to question, to observe, to verify. The incident became a benchmark for the neighborhood, a story recounted not with excitement, but with awareness. And every time someone recalls the day the veteran was challenged, they remember the subtle yet undeniable truth. Power can be abused, but integrity can endure. For me personally, witnessing the transformation was profound. I saw firsthand how relentless pressure can escalate, how authority can become overreach, and how resilience, documentation, and measured response can reverse what seems like inevitable defeat. The tension that had gripped us all, the spiraling loops of fines, inspections, accusations, and public scrutiny, finally resolved not with drama, but with clarity and principle. Even now, I reflect on the moral weight of the story. The HOA believed they were untouchable. They didn't anticipate that a single, reasonable homeowner, armed with patience and evidence, could dismantle the illusion of control. Their mistakes were permanent, and the lesson was obvious to anyone paying attention. The system didn't fail because of inaction, it failed because of arrogance. And yet, the quiet irony lingers. The veteran's calm, measured approach didn't just protect him. It illuminated every flaw, every overreach, and every lapse of judgment the HOA had made. What could have been a private humiliation became a public accountability lesson. And it's that irony that stays with me. The very tactics intended to dominate and intimidate ended up exposing the HOA more than anyone could have predicted. It took months to settle, but the lesson was clear. Systems designed for order can be corrupted by power. Authority can be misused when oversight is absent. And yet, even within those structures, one person's diligence, patience, and courage can reset the balance entirely. The veteran didn't just win a personal battle. He reshaped expectations, redefined accountability, and reminded everyone that fairness isn't optional, it's essential. And as I look back on it now, I can't help but wonder, if this could happen in my neighborhood, could it happen in yours? How many minor rules, or enforcement notices, hide the potential for the same spiral of control and intimidation? Sometimes, the smallest actions reveal the largest injustices, and the quietest resistance becomes the most powerful force. The veteran's story ended not with applause, but with recognition, reflection, and respect. The HOA's story ended not with triumph, but with lessons written in ink, in law, and in memory. And the neighborhood, forever altered, now carries a quiet understanding. Authority is only as strong as the fairness behind it, and the consequences of overreach never disappear, they echo. In the end, what seemed like the end was really just the beginning. A beginning for accountability, a beginning for vigilance, and a beginning for anyone who believes that even the most entrenched power can be questioned, challenged, and ultimately corrected. The neighborhood may have returned to its routines, but the memory of that day, and the lessons it taught, remains, quiet but undeniable, for anyone willing to see it. Sometimes, the smallest rules reveal the biggest injustices. And sometimes, the calmest voice, armed with patience and principle, can topple the most confident authority. If this story tells us anything, it's this: fairness doesn't wait for opportunity. It's created, defended, and, when necessary, demanded. And as I reflect on everything that happened, one thought lingers. How many communities have their own quiet battles, waiting for someone to stand up and remind authority that power is never absolute, and that injustice, no matter how bureaucratic, can always be challenged?